Hey, what's up you guys? Today I'm going to be discussing two of the biggest celebrity deaths and some of the conspiracies around them. First, I'm going to begin with talking about Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was a recognizable actress, model, and singer during the 1950s and 60s, and she's famous for playing blonde bombshell characters, and she became one of the most popular sex symbols of her time. She was also married to Joe DiMaggio and was friends with some really famous people like Frank Sinatra and even the Kennedy brothers, which we'll be getting into a little bit later. Lawford to, quote, say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. Lawford would later report that Marilyn sounded drugged and would get her lawyer to eventually call her house and speak to her housekeeper Eunice Murray. Eunice Murray slept at the movie star's house that night at the request of Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, and she said to the lawyer that Monroe was fine. But later, Murray would become concerned when she woke up around 3 a.m. to find the light in Marilyn's room still on. After testing the door and finding it locked, the housekeeper began to scream Marilyn's name. Murray then called Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist. He rushed to Marilyn's house and managed to break through her bedroom window. He found her naked under the sheets and clutching the telephone. Monroe's bedside table was filled with medicine bottles, which led Greenson to call Marilyn's actual doctor, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, who pronounced her dead and then called the police, who arrived around 4:30 a.m. Monroe was dead for hours at this point, with the case estimating that she died around 8 to 10 p.m. that night before. Marilyn's body was then taken to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office the same day, and an autopsy was performed. The toxicology report, which came back later that night, showed the actress's blood contained a sleeping pill called chlorohydrate, and her liver showed the presence of a drug called pentobarbital. This drug was used to treat anxiety, tension, nervousness, and insomnia. Because her levels of this drug were so high, they were even much higher than the fatal dose, and because the pills had been ingested within a short amount of time, estimated to be about a minute, the coroner ruled that Monroe's death was most likely a probable suicide. The initial police report stated that Marilyn's death may have been an accident, but the investigation soon concluded that it was a suicide. This is in part to her being a very troubled person. Monroe had a rough childhood and spent most of it in foster homes, and the darkness from this time never really left her, so she suffered from anxiety and depression, which led her to turn to drugs and alcohol for help. Even one of Monroe's close friends, James Bacon, recalled how one night he observed her overindulging in a destructive way. He said, quote, Monroe was drinking champagne and straight vodka and occasionally popping a pill. I said, Marilyn, the combination of pills and alcohol will kill you. And she said, it hasn't killed me yet. Then she took another drink and popped another pill. End quote. So given her history of depression and substance abuse, it wasn't hard to believe that the death of Marilyn Monroe was a suicide, or at least a tragic accident of a woman who had finally taken one too many pills and had one too many drinks. But looking deeper into the case has many others believing that Marilyn's death wasn't an accident or a suicide, but actually murder. One of the main pieces of evidence to support this is that according to the coroner's report, Marilyn Monroe overdosed on pills, as I told you before, but however no pills were found in her stomach. The deputy coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, later explained that the lack of pills could be a result from her long history of substance abuse, but the science behind this is really spotty and there isn't much to support this statement. Also, according to the same Dr. Noguchi, when he received Marilyn Monroe's body in the morgue, the samples from her stomach and intestines had been destroyed, and he also discovered that while some of the organs were sent to the toxicology lab, tests weren't really done on them, and the only parts of Marilyn's body that were put to a complete toxicology test was her liver. Another weird occurrence is that Detective Robert E. Bryan noted in his report that Murray, the housekeeper, was acting like an unreliable witness, and he wrote, quote, it is an officer's opinion that Miss Murray was vague and possibly evasive in answering questions pertaining to the activities of Miss Monroe during this time, end quote. Conspiracy theorists have used Mary's weird behavior as proof that there was something inappropriate and fishy going on that night, and that the housekeeper possibly knew more than she was letting on. As I stated before, Marilyn actually had 2 phone calls the night that she died, and one of them was before the conversation with Peter Lawford, and that was with Joe DiMaggio Jr. This call was between 7 and 7:15 p.m., and by all accounts it was a very happy conversation, and even the housekeeper later confirmed that Marilyn was anything but depressed during the phone call, but then possibly an hour to 3 hours later she was literally dying and she sounded drugged during the phone call with Peter Lawford. The last bit that really is like the icing on top of the cake is that the police weren't notified of the tragedy until after Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, and her physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, had visited her home. The Los Angeles Police Department was called around 4:25 p.m., which is almost an hour and a half after Marilyn was supposedly found unresponsive by her housekeeper. So during that time where the police weren't there, Eunice Murray, Dr. Greenson, and Dr. Engelberg were alone at the scene. When Sergeant Jack Clemens asked why the police hadn't been notified earlier, the doctor said they needed permission from 20th Century Fox's publicity department before they could alert law enforcement. One of the main theories is that the Kennedy brothers murdered Marilyn or hired someone to do it. There was speculation that she was having an affair with Robert Kennedy, and Monroe reportedly divulged this fact to many of her friends and her psychiatrists. The idea of an affair between Marilyn and Robert Kennedy became widely believed when, during a BBC interview in 1983, Eunice Murray broke down and stated, quote, "Well, of course Bobby Kennedy was there on August 4th, and of course there was an affair with Bobby Kennedy," end quote. August 4th was actually the night that Marilyn died, between that 8 and 10 p.m. This also began to seem even more realistic in October 2017 with the release of the JFK files. In 2017, the American government released thousands of classified documents relating to the JFK assassination, and one of them was a letter from the FBI to Robert that warned him that there was a book planning to reveal the details of Marilyn and his rumored affair. Due to these facts, as well as the continued speculation of an affair with also the president, John F. Kennedy, many believe that there was a secret plot to fake her suicide because it is believed that she threatened to make their affairs public. JFK has also been known to be a drug addict, specifically to methamphetamine. While he was under the influence, author and Hollywood historian Bill Barnes revealed that, quote, "Marilyn said that when she and John Kennedy were together, he would whisper things to her that were classified state secrets," end quote. It is said that Marilyn Monroe also kept a little red book that contains state secrets that JFK may have let slip during their affair. Some experts believe that Marilyn Monroe was killed over this diary. There was also a partially redacted FBI document found in 2007 that may link the Kennedys to Monroe's death. It suggests through unclear means the Kennedys sought to provide Monroe with drugs that would cause her to overdose and then subsequently leave her to die. While this is the main theory, there are a couple more theories out there, like the famous Chicago mafia boss Sam Giancana ordered Monroe to be killed. It is speculated that Giancana orchestrated Monroe's first big Hollywood contract in exchange for her to seduce powerful men that he could later then blackmail. Giancana supposedly grew concerned over what Monroe knew and thus had her house bugged by famous wiretapper Bernard Spindle. Spindle claims to have heard Kennedy and Monroe fighting on the night of her death, but these recordings have said to be destroyed in 1966. There are also those who believe that the CIA killed her because she knew too much about the Kennedys and secret state information, which also links back to her little red book. So speaking of the Kennedy brothers, now I want to talk about the JFK assassination case. John F. Kennedy, often referred to by the initials JFK, was an American politician who served as the 35th President of the United States. Over 50 years after his presidency, John F. Kennedy still remains one of the most admired U.S. presidents of the post-World War II era. But unfortunately, he was assassinated shortly after noon on November 22, 1963. By the fall of 1963, John F. Kennedy and his political advisors were preparing for the next election. He knew the importance of winning over Texas, so he planned a trip there with the help of his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. The first stop of his tour was San Antonio, Texas. The next stop was Dallas, which is where the president would meet his untimely fate. After disembarking from the plane that took them from San Antonio to Dallas, the president and Mrs. Kennedy got into a waiting limousine after shaking hands with the crowd waiting for them at the airport. Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie were already seated in the open convertible as the Kennedys entered and sat behind them. The motorcade then left the airport and traveled along a 10-mile route that wound through downtown Dallas on the way to the Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to speak at a luncheon. Crowds of excited people lined the streets and waved to the Kennedys. The car turned off Main Street at Delhi Plaza around 12:30 p.m. As it was passing the Texas School Book Depository, the president was struck by 2 bullets, one in the neck and one in the head, and he then slumped towards Mrs. Kennedy. The governor was also shot in the back. The convertible then rushed to the Parkland Memorial Hospital just a few minutes away. A Catholic priest was summoned to administer the last rites, and at 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Governor Connolly would later then go on to recover. Just over an hour after JFK was pronounced dead, the police had already arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald is the official confirmed shooter of the JFK assassination and was also at the time a recently hired employee of the Texas School Book Depository. He was stationed on the 6th floor of the depository and shot JFK with a rifle from one of the windows. 2 days later, on November 24th, Oswald was scheduled to be transferred from police headquarters to county jail, and suddenly a man aimed a pistol and fired at him at point-blank range, killing the assassinator. The assailant was identified as Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner. Oswald died 2 days later at the Parkland Memorial Hospital, which is the same hospital that JFK died in. On November 29, 1963, the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, appointed the President's Commission of the Assassination of President Kennedy, otherwise known as the Warren Commission, named after its chairman, Earl Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the United States at the time. President Johnson directed the commission to evaluate matters relating to the assassination and the subsequent killing of the alleged assassin and to report any findings to him. They found that Oswald acted alone, and that's been the official story since. So there is one main piece of evidence that was used by the Warren Commission, and that was the Zapruder film. Dressmaker Abraham Zapruder brought his camera to see President John F. Kennedy's motorcade and record one of the only videos of President Kennedy's assassination. His home movie would become one of the most watched films of all time. Even today, the Zapruder film is seen as evidence in countless conspiracy theories about who shot the president. Some other evidence that is used in conspiracy theories is the route of the motorcade through Dallas because of the amount of turns it had in it. This would lead the motorcade to slow down, and they also decided to go by the Texas School Book Depository where Oswald was stationed to shoot the president. This building was known to have 20,000 windows, and since there weren't enough Secret Service men to place in every single window, they just decided to check and station men in none of them. They could have easily decided to not go past this building and take another route instead, but they didn't. Oswald was also under investigation by the local FBI and was a new employee at the School Book Depository, but supposedly the local FBI did not inform the Secret Service about this. One of the big theories surrounding the JFK assassination is that there were two shooters instead of one. The first shot has been proven that it came from behind, which is where Lee Harvey Oswald was angled, but the second bullet is constantly debated over, and that was the one that went through his head. So when the president was shot by the second bullet, he was thrown violently backwards into the left, as you would expect someone who was shot by a bullet from the front, not from behind. What was also considered the entrance wound at the back of his head looked more like an exit wound because it had more damage, which normally a bullet goes in smoothly in the back and then comes out and will leave damage at the exit wound, but there was a lot more damage at the entrance wound and it was smooth at the exit. There was a grassy knoll right across from the president's motorcade, and it was believed that that's where the second shooter was stationed. This theory was heavily believed and is still heavily believed despite new evidence coming out. So an expert has proven that there can be this kind of damage from an entrance wound, they're just not as common. So when the president was shot from behind, his head actually exploded, and this was shown in a model by Nicholas Nile, a researcher at the IMSG Inc. And this demonstrates that a temporary cavity formed inside the president's soft tissue of his head as the momentum and kinetic energy of the bullet smashed into his skull, causing the damage at the entrance. But there is other evidence that does support the two-shooter theory, like the fact that it would have been very difficult, nearly impossible for Oswald to have reloaded and shot 2 bullets that quickly. The audio recordings taken from the Zapruder film suggest gunfire from multiple points. The other big theory is not so much about how many shooters there were, but it's about who actually decided to kill the president. So it is believed the government and the FBI hired Lee Harvey Oswald or any other shooters to assassinate JFK, specifically Lyndon B. Johnson, who was JFK's vice president. He supposedly did this for political gain because before Kennedy was elected, Lyndon B. Johnson also attempted to take the Democratic nomination from JFK at the 1960 Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. Lyndon B. Johnson also played one of the biggest roles in why Kennedy even went to Dallas in the first place, And there's also a supposed incident that supports this theory as well. A woman named Marilyn Brown claimed to have an affair with Lyndon B. Johnson, and she claimed that she attended a party with Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, and J. Edgar Hoover the night before the assassination. Supposedly, Lyndon B. Johnson whispered to her, quote, "After tomorrow, those Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise," end quote. And so this is one of the biggest evidence that supports that Lyndon B. Johnson or anybody else in the government or the FBI wanted to kill JFK. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. These are just some examples of ways that we can always think deeper into what we are told by the media, because not everything that we're told by the government and the media is true. And I think it's just really important to make sure that we're evaluating everything that we're told and we don't just believe it wholeheartedly.